All right, we are going to talk about just the first couple of sections of chapter 10. We're not going to get into the later sections because that's just muscle names, and we are going to be covering that in the lab material over the next couple of weeks. So we're going to talk about the roles of different types of muscles that fall into the categories of agonists and antagonists. We're going to look at structure, organization of the muscle fascicles, how they generate force. We're going to talk about how skeletal muscles are named, and then, like I said, in lab, we will learn some of the skeletal muscle names and their actions, and then I'm going to talk a little bit in these videos about origins and insertions. So for section 2 and 3, that's what I'm focusing on this week, and everything else in chapter 10 will be covered in lab. But we are going to talk about fascicle arrangement, how skeletal muscles work together or against each other, and then something called the lever system. So skeletal muscles are going to interact with each other in some various ways. And so before we get into that, let's talk about origins and insertions of muscles. So this information for the muscles we're covering in lab has been provided to you in the lab study guide, but you are not required to learn the origins and insertions of any of the muscles. You just need to learn names of the muscles and their actions. But the origin and insertion of muscles can be really helpful to know to determine what action that muscle would do. So that's why that information is provided, even though you are not required to learn it. So the insertion of a muscle is where that muscle connects to that is going to move. So this is the movable end of the muscle attaching to whatever bone is being pulled on. All right. The origin of the muscle is the end of it that is attached to a fixed bone, so that bone is not what's being pulled to move something. All right, and I'll give some examples of this in a little bit. Muscles can be grouped into how they react or interact together. So a single action can involve multiple muscles. So as we're learning some of these muscles in lab over the next couple of weeks, you'll see multiple muscles are going to have the exact same action because they are working together to do that action. So muscles can be grouped into 4 main groups. First is a prime mover or agonist. This is going to be the main muscle that is involved in whatever action is being performed, like flexion or extension. Next group is a synergist. This is a muscle that is going to assist that prime mover. So it's going to work with it to increase the strength of that action. Our next group is fixators. These are stabilizing the bone. That's the attachment point for the prime mover origin. So this fixator is going to help stabilize the origin point of a prime mover. And then antagonists are going to have the opposite action of that prime mover. So a classic example of a prime mover versus an antagonist are the biceps and triceps muscles. And in lab, you're going to learn that there's one extra part to the names of those muscles that you are required to know. So the biceps brachii and triceps brachii. So for the action of flexion of the arm, so flexion at the elbow, so being able to basically flex your biceps muscles and make those guns or whatever they're called. Clearly I'm not a weightlifter or anything. So the biceps brachii could be considered a prime mover for that flexion action, so flexing at the elbow. And then the antagonist is going to be the triceps brachii, and its job is extension at the elbow. And then just to kind of add into that, one of the other muscles that you're going to be learning this week is the brachialis muscle, and it is a synergist to the biceps brachii, and it is going to assist with that flexion at the elbow. All right. So here's a great example of that. So we've got that biceps brachii as a prime mover. The brachialis is a synergist. There's another muscle that we will learn next week, which is the brachioradialis, which is also a synergist to the biceps brachii, helping with that flexion at the elbow. And then we've got that triceps brachii being the antagonist. All right. So just that first example right here, agonist is the biceps brachii, triceps brachii is the antagonist. Hamstrings muscles, this is a group of 3 different muscles that we will be learning next week. And this is going to be on the posterior side of the thigh, so the back of the thigh. That would be an agonist to flexing at the knee. And then the quadriceps are a group of 4 muscles on the anterior side of the thigh, so the front of the thigh. We'll also be learning these next week, and they are going to extend at the knee, extend at the knee. All right, I'm not going to go over this last example, but this is muscles in the forearm that are going to flex the wrist and fingers and then extend the wrist and fingers. All right. Let's talk about how the muscle fascicles are arranged. So if you remember from a previous video, the paramecium is the connective tissue that's bundling multiple muscle fibers or muscle cells together into fascicles. And the way these fascicles are arranged within a muscle is directly related or correlated to the force that is generated by that muscle. So what is that muscle doing? And this is also going to affect the range of motion of that muscle, so how far that muscle is able to stretch or contract. Skeletal muscles can be classified based on how these fascicles are arranged. Parallel muscles are going to have fascicles that are all arranged in the same direction as the long axis of the muscle. Most of our skeletal muscles fall into this group. So briefly coming back to this biceps brachii muscle, all of those fascicles are arranged in the same direction, going up and down along the humerus. So that is that parallel fascicle organization. And again, this is most of the muscles, skeletal muscles in our body. Some parallel muscles can be flat sheets. We'll see that with some of the abdominal muscles that we'll cover this week. And then our next group are circular muscles. And the name here is pretty self-explanatory. So circular muscles are going to be muscles that occur in a circular appearance. These are also sometimes called sphincters. We'll learn some sphincters later on in the semester with some other body systems. And so when these muscles are relaxed, it's going to increase the size of the opening, and when they contract, they are going to close or shrink that opening. So one example of this that's not technically a sphincter is the orbicularis oris. This is the circular muscle that goes around the mouth. And so when that muscle contracts, the mouth or oral opening is going to get smaller, such as like what happens when you pucker your lips to whistle. And then when they relax, the mouth is going to open. Next up is convergent muscles. Convergent muscles are going to have a pretty sizable area, so they're going to extend over a pretty broad area of the body, but the fascicles end up coming together in a single common attachment point. That attachment point could be a tendon, or something called an aponeurosis, which is a flat, broad tendon. Some of the larger muscles of the chest and back fall into this category, so the pectoralis major is an example of convergent muscle. We'll see that is one of the muscles we'll learn, and so you'll see how that shape exists. So it's spread out, it's kind of like a fan. So there's that base point, usually attaching to a tendon, and then it spreads out. And then the other end of those fascicles are going to attach broadly across some other point. And then pinnate muscles can be things that blend into a tendon. Penna means feathers. And there's different subcategories of this, as you can see. So pinnate muscles are going to blend into a tendon that runs through the central region of the muscle for its entire length, kind of like the quill of a feather. So that there's that kind of hard part of feathers that runs throughout the entire feather, and then the smaller parts, the softer parts, are going to spread out from that. All right. Because of this design, pinnate muscles can only pull at an angle, because they're not going to move their tendons very far, but these can also hold a lot more muscle fibers within it, which can produce a lot more tension for its size. So unipinnate muscles, these are going to be where the fascicles are located only on one side of the tendon. There is a muscle called the extensor digitorum in the forearm that we'll learn next week. And that is going to that muscle is going to extend the finger joints and wrist. Bipinnate muscles, bi means two. These are going to have fascicles on both sides of the tendon. An example of this is the rectus femoris that we'll learn next week as well. This is one of the quadriceps muscles in the upper leg. Sometimes these muscle fibers can also wrap around the tendon, and that is going to be a multi-pinnate muscle. So instead of those fibers just being on one or two sides of that tendon, they can be on all sides of it, or multiple sides, if not all. A really good example of this is the deltoid muscle in the shoulder. It has a single tendon that is going to be associated with that muscle. So because of these fascicle arrangements, multipinnate muscles like the deltoid can be stimulated by the nervous system to change the direction of that pull. And so this is part of the reason why we have such a big range of motion in our shoulder. So it doesn't just have to do with that ball and socket joint that is formed by the bones, but it also has to do with the muscles that are helping to form that. And so that deltoid muscle on the shoulder is going to allow us to be able to move our shoulder anterior or posterior, or medial or lateral, or in any kind of in-between direction from any of those. So here's some pictures of what a lot of these look like. So we've got that circular muscle, the orbicularis oris, around the mouth. Here's our multipinnate deltoid muscle right here. Biceps brachii, this is a parallel muscle right there. Rectus femoris, again, part of the quadriceps in the leg. This is that bipinnate. You can kind of see how those fibers are running in two different directions. We've got a sartorius down here in the leg that we'll learn. This is another parallel muscle. Extensor digitorum, again, here is a unipinnate, and then that pectoralis major in the chest is convergent, so you can see it's very much fan-shaped. All right, let's talk briefly about the lever system. So skeletal muscles are not going to do work all by themselves. The reason they're called skeletal muscles is because they're going to attach to the skeleton itself. And so the skeleton, the bones, and the muscles have to act together to move the body. Bones, because they are stiff, are levers, and those articular endings of the bone at the joints act as something called a fulcrum. And this is a lot of physics-related terms, but we don't need to go into an immense amount of detail about those because this is not a physics class, obviously. But these are really important parts of how muscles move the body. So imagine using a hammer to remove a nail out of a piece of wood or a wall or something like that. The handle of that hammer is going to act as the lever, and it's going to help apply some of that force. And then a fulcrum is a fixed point that the force is applied to. And the fulcrum in this scenario would be the head of the hammer that's going to be actually connecting with the nail that you're trying to remove. And so it's functioning as that fixed point for where the force is being applied to. When you kind of push or pull down on the handle to pull that nail out. All right. The load is an object being lifted or any resistance to that movement, and then effort or applied force comes from the actual contraction of those skeletal muscles. We've got 3 types of lever systems in the body based on the arrangement pattern of that fulcrum, the amount of resistance, and the applied force. All right, so we've got first, second, and third class levers. So a first class lever over here in panel A is going to occur when the fulcrum lies in between the resistance and the applied force. So an example of that here is tilting your head backwards. So that fulcrum is right about here where the skull and vertebrae connect to each other. So that's our fulcrum. And so that resistance is being applied in an upward direction to lift the head up. And that is going to cause that muscle back here to contract. And so we've got this little physics-like diagram down here that kind of simplifies that a little bit. Next up is our second class levers here in the middle. This is where that resistance is in between the fulcrum and the applied force. So we're kind of changing this up a little bit. Fulcrum is going to be at one end, resistance is going to be in the middle, applied force is going to be at the other end from the fulcrum. So an example of this is down here at the lower leg, being able to contract this calf muscle that we'll learn next week is going to be an example of that second class lever system. So when you stand up on your tippy toes, this is what's happening to allow you to stand on your tippy toes. And then our third class lever system is going to have that applied force in between the fulcrum and the resistance. So flexing at the elbow with that biceps brachii muscle, the elbow joint is functioning as the actual fulcrum, and then the lower arm, so the forearm, is offering that resistance. And we will continue with naming skeletal muscles in the next video.